Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Werner. I'm an alumni advisor with the Georgetown Wargaming Society, and it's a pleasure today to welcome you all to this event and to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Michael Dunn. Mike Dunn, he's currently a Department of Army civilian. He works as a battle simulation specialist with the Directorate of Simulation Education at Army University in Fort Leavenworth. He has taught courses on simulations and games, as well as exercise design at the Command and General Staff College since 2011, and among a variety of other very impressive work that he has done with the Army and the military. So before I hand it over to Mr. Dunn to present on his wargaming and the military decision-making process, I'm just going to say right now that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We're going to be collecting them as the event goes on, and Mike will respond to them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Michael Dunn.
Hi, good evening. I'm coming to you today from an undisclosed location in Fort Benning, Georgia, which is why you see the finest of hotel decor behind me. The disclaimer that, as always, I need to start off with was that the views expressed in this slide are my slide and do not represent the views of the Army University, the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or any other official government agency. All right, now that's out of the way. Let's go ahead and get started. Oops, hold on 1 second. There we go. All right, so my talk tonight is going to come from primarily 3 different publications that we have. Field Manual 6.0, Army Techniques Publication 5-0.2, Volume 1, and a Center for Army Lessons Learned document, How to Master Wargaming. All of these are releasable to the public, and they are available for download. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the military decision-making process. It is one of 3 planning methodologies that the Army advocates. Army Design Method, the military decision-making process, which we're talking about, and troop leadership procedures. MDMP is something that is done primarily at battalion level through the upper staff levels of corps and sometimes combatant commands. Army design methodology is really more for a strategic context, or more for a what they called wicked problems. And troop leadership procedures are pretty much at the very low tactical level. You'll find TLPs are done by company and below. The reason why battalion is the first place you'll see MDMP is that is the first echelon that actually has a staff that will do these things. And as you can see at the bottom part is it's used for planning and orders production. And it really is a great way to make sure that everything is coordinated both horizontally and vertically as you're putting together your planning products. All right, so who takes part in MDMP? Well, the commander is central to all this. And what we're getting at the upper tactical level are those 3 real fundamental decisions that they get to make. Decision 1, how do I array the forces? Decision 2, when do I commit my reserve? And decision 3, when to issue change of mission. Once the commander has that in mind, kind of what his concept is, he'll issue planning guidance to the staff. He'll be going in and out of the command post, but he will be there to participate in key moments of planning. And understand that this is really driven by information. Commanders most of the time are going to be out there trying to gain that information about their own unit, the elements to the left or right, the higher units, and the enemy situation. So it's not uncommon for the commander for her to be in and out of the command post, trying to get that information that they really, really need. All right, let's talk about the staff, the ones that actually will do the majority of the work for this. They're the ones that are going to take that commander's guidance and they'll flesh it out and they'll issue a series of orders. The staff is led by a chief of staff, or at the brigade and battalion level, the executive officer, and that's the second in command usually. And the chief of staff or executive officer is the one that sets the planning timeline. We have a 1/3, 2/3 rule, that 1/3 of the time that you have before you have to execute the mission is taken up by your echelon to do the planning, and the rest of the 2/3 of the time is used for preparation and for the subordinate commands to do their planning. Who's on the staff? Well, you'll see a G1/S1. G stands for general. So if you're an echelon commanded by a flag officer, it's going to be a G staff. And if you're at a lower level staff commanded by a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, it's going to be just a S staff. You've got the 1, which takes care of all the different personnel actions. The 2 is very critical. That talks about the intelligence picture, also templates what the enemy is going to do. You have the operations officer, the 3, and that's usually a fairly senior person in the staff. And it's not uncommon for the 3 to be the same rank as the chief of staff or the executive officer. And the 3 oftentimes will take a very, very proactive role in the integration of the staff. The 4 is also very, very critical, and that is the person that handles the logistics. The 5, you'll find that only at brigade and above, and that is a separate section that actually will do long-range planning. And of course, the 6, the communications officer, the person that will make sure that all the digital products are able to get out to everybody. All right, let's talk real briefly, well, more than briefly, about the MDMP. There are 7 steps involved, and you'll notice that throughout the 7 steps, there's actually 3 warning orders that are given. The reason why we give out warning orders is it's an alert to our subordinate units that, hey, there's something coming up, heads up. And this will really kind of allow for parallel planning that has your echelon are doing these steps, your lower echelon can get an advance on doing their 7 steps of the MDMP. All right, step 1, receive your mission. The doctrinal answer to this is that you step 1, receive the mission. It formally starts when you get your operations order. However, it will informally start on the first warning order and the second warning order that you receive from your higher echelon. So what you're getting here is, hey, here's a mission, and the output of this step is that you're giving your subordinates a similar heads up. And you're basically putting together your timeline as to when your order is going to be ready to go. The second step is start mission analysis. This is a very involved, detailed step. And this is where you have your staff and the commander looking at what was given to them. And they're looking for those things that are key that they need to do to be successful in their mission. So the key thing is the commander's initial guidance. And the staff is going to analyze a whole bunch of factors based upon what they received. And they're going to condense that down and distill it to those things that that echelon needs to do. They'll come up with a mission statement, which is absolutely key. So once this is done, then we go to the next step, and that is to develop courses of action for us to achieve our mission. The inputs are essentially what you're looking for mission analysis. Basically, the 3 things you're looking for are what's the status of my forces, what is the intelligence picture about the enemy forces looking like, and what are the effects of the terrain and weather and the civilian on the battlefield component, and how will that affect our mission? And this is where you're going to start really laying out how your forces are going to be arrayed in relation to each other, and what do they need to do to accomplish the mission. Doctrinally, we are to develop 3 courses of action, and each course of action must pass the FAST-CD test. It needs to be feasible. Can we do this? It needs to be acceptable. Will this do what we need it to do? Is it suitable? Is it, does it meet the higher intention, and does it fit in well with our higher echelon? Complete. Does it take us all the way from mission start to mission end? And distinguishable. Is this KOA actually really different from the other two courses of action that we're developing? So one of the key outputs of KOA development is the KOA Sketch. And what you're seeing at the top are 3 battalions and 1 battalion-sized task force as a decision graphic, and you're seeing a company that is being held in reserve. This is essentially a shorthand way for planners to assign units and essentially take a look at what enablers they need to be plussed up with. You see example of that with the 1st of the 68th Armor, where you see that it has 2 mechanized companies, 2 armor companies, and 2 combat engineer companies assigned to it. And also what I'm looking at is, if you look at the graphics, you'll notice that the main effort is 168 infantry attacking along axis Zeus to seize objective Center City. And again, that's just being able to read the graphics and understand what you're looking at. Along with the sketch is a statement, and this really gets somewhat involved. It's a restatement of what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, and that's the mission. The commander's intent is something that the commander will write, which will delineate her vision of what they expect at the end state to be the end state. Where do they want to be positioned, and how do they want to be positioned when the operation is over, and what constitutes mission success. For those of you that do hobby wargaming, basically what you're doing is you're setting out your victory conditions with this. As I mentioned before, command and control is very much an information-driven activity. So we're talking about information collection, and then we start talking about the actual sequence of events that are happening. The decisive operation is the key thing that the echelon must do in order to be successful. To support that, you have various shaping operations that other units are going to be conducting to set up the conditions for the decisive operation to be successful. And then you talk about some of the other warfighting functions that will contribute to it, such as fires and sustainment and mission command. All right, so you got your 3 KOAs developed, and then we go into KOA analysis, or the war game. We're going to come back to this in a bit. I just want to go ahead and finish up an overview of MDMP and what their steps entail. After you do your KOA analysis, then you do your comparison of your 3 courses of action, and you basically choose the one that has the best shot of achieving the commander's intent, the victory conditions that were defined. You can do it in a way of listing the advantages or the disadvantages. You can create a decision matrix where you are essentially assigning criteria to it if you want to be mathematically inclined. I found, though, that usually the decision matrix is not used as often as basically the advantages and disadvantages. Kind of hard to quantify something that really doesn't involve a lot of hard factors. It really depends on the feel of the commander and staff about the KOAs they developed. All right, so after you do your comparison, you check to see if the commander will approve it. Is this something that the commander really wants to see? And if so, what tweaks does the commander want to have to the KOA before it gets issued? And then finally, you have the approved course of action, and you'll start turning it into an operations order, which, depending on the echelon, can be very, very involved and detailed and can consume dozens, if not hundreds of pages, or it can be very, very small. It can only be like a 2 or 3 page document. Once you have your operation order produced, and why you have a very large one is that it will take you from mission start to mission end, and any changes you need to make to it, you'll issue a fragmentary order, or FRAGO, during execution. the more that you're able to put in the op order, the less you kind of have to put in the frago. So we talked about the 1/3, 2/3 rule. Like most things in the Army, we're following the operations process, which is plan, prepare, and execute with assessment all the way throughout. So we're using the same method to divide up our time line that we've got. So the 1/3, 2/3 rule states that the echelon you're at should take 1/3 of the time to plan, leaving the other 2/3 of the time for your subordinate elements to do their planning and preparation. So you'll notice that, let's say we're at division, then it gets chopped down for the brigade, and then it gets chopped down to the battalion, then it gets chopped down to a company to do their thing. And they're using troop leadership procedures. This will give you an understanding why we do TLPs, because they do not require a full-up staff, and they are a lot quicker to execute than MDMP. And as you can see, by the time it gets to the company level, your preparation time really isn't a whole heck of a lot. Fortunately, we've got these warning orders to assist with this, to try to cut some time off of the 1/3, 2/3 rule. In actual execution, the aim point we're trying to get at is at maybe 1/5, 4/5, 1/4, 3/4 rule. That's why the different warning orders has the different steps of MDMP, such as mission analysis is done, or course of action approval is done. We're able to pass that on to the lower echelons so they can continue on with their planning process of MDMP. Now, note the circled 30 to 35%. That is about the amount of time that needs to be spent during your planning time for analysis, comparison, and approval. And the largest part of that time is going to be done by the course of action analysis. So kind of think about that as the time that you will have available to do that wargaming. All right, so let's talk about the wargame itself. And this is coming from Field Manual 6-0. Our staff processes, and this is what the doctrinal guidance is that we have, what we need to do. It tells us what our key inputs are. Again, the sketch and guidance are the two big ones, and what we need to come up with is the way to look at this course of action and have a refined course of action as an output. And so you'll notice that we go into wargaming, and the reason why I have this up here is what we think of as a war game is vastly different from what military Army officers think of as a war game. When you say war game to an Army officer and a Marine officer, they're going to think automatically that it is course of action analysis and everything that's involved in it. It's not the sequential tabletop exercise that we're used to in the non-Army realm. Okay, the first step, gather your tools. All right, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and get everything that we need. The sketches and the statements of what we're looking at. Let's get the map, let's get the pieces, and let's get them all together. Let's go ahead and list out all our forces. Let's list all of our assumptions. And let's identify two key things that we need for to execute the wargame itself: the critical events and the decision points. The critical events are those things that we're actually going to be wargaming, those different parts of the battle as it unfolds that we really need to set the conditions to win that event. And the decision point, which is the point in time and space that a commander is going to make a decision that will affect the outcome of a critical event. All right, so we're getting ready to wargame, and we have three different ways that we can do so: the belt method, the box method, and the avenue and depth method. The box method is really probably the quickest way to do it, where you're going to just pick a variety of key events or decision points to go ahead and just wargame that out. The belt method is kind of what we're used to in the civilian hobby gaming world, where you're pretty much doing the entire area of operation across the entire depth of the area of operation over the entire time of the operation. Then the avenue in depth. This is where you're going to take a look at different parts of the operation where you have units that are attacking on different avenues of approach, axis of advances that may not be aligned together for they're operating in a disjointed way. In a time-constrained environment, more often than not, we'll do the box method because we really want to focus in on those real key decisions or decision points that are really kind of critical to us. If time to improve, belt method is a bit more in depth and complete. All right, very good. You selected your technique, and now you're going to select a way to record your results of your war game. And two methods is a synchronization matrix, which you'll see all the different, what the enemy is doing, what's happening on the environment with civilians, your decision points, and you're looking at all the different warfighting functions as to what they're going to do. And you're going to basically phase it out in terms of time, which I actually really do not like. I prefer phases as detailed in different events. It should be event-driven, not time-driven. The other method, which is the one I prefer, is the sketch note method. And this is where you're going to identify those key events or decision points that you're going to war game. And you'll make a note about how the war game unfolds, and this will be where you want to record it. All right, Doctrine tells us, go ahead and conduct the war game using a method of action, reaction, counteraction, and the things that you should consider. And then Doctrine moves right along to the results of the war game, what you should have as a takeaway. Okay, big problem. Doctrine doesn't tell us how to do this. And so we have a lot of Army professionals and Marine professionals that are kind of at sea as to, all right, it's good to tell us do action, reaction, counteraction. What does that mean? How do we do it? Well, let's go ahead and step back and review a quick bit of history as to how this is the state of affairs. Back in the 19th century, the Prussians who developed Creekspiel in the 1820s after the Napoleonic Wars started using it. And so by the mid-century, they were very proficient. So in 1864, they went to war against the Danes and, of course, beat the Danes. Yeah, big deal. Prussia beat up a small country. Yeah. But 1866, they went to war with the Austrians, which was probably a peer competitor, and they beat them. So that got some people thinking. And then in 1870-71, they beat the French, which at the time was considered the military superpower on the continent. That got everybody's attention. And one of the things that everybody looked at is, how did the Prussians pull this off? And one of the factors was the Creekspiels. Creekspiel, up until this point, was strict Creekspiel, where you had a book of very rigid rules that you will follow to the T. And the goodness of this is it allowed for you to have some models that were very well defined and very well understood. The downside, it took a lot of time and it was very tedious. Those of us that are hobby miniature gamers, hey, this is our wheelhouse. So one of the German marshals, you see pictured there, Verdi du Vinois, he came with the idea that, hey, we fought and won 3 wars. We probably don't need to go through the entire step-by-step, long drawn-out method of strict Creekspiel. We can instead rely upon the experience and the judgment of our veterans that went through these 3 wars. So this was born the concept of free Creekspiel, where you can have the officers that are experienced do the adjudication of what would happen. Now, the goodness of this is that it relies on the hard-won experience of those that fought the wars. Here's the flip side of that. It relies on the hard-won experience of those that have fought the wars. If you don't have a cadre of officers that have that hard-won experience, well, you're really may not get the best judgment. And that's kind of where we are with our officer corps, is that yes, even though we've been involved in 20 years of war, it's not the right kind of war. We were involved in counterinsurgency and stability operations. Now that we've returned back to large-scale combat operations, which arguably we've not done since 2003 when we did the Thunder Run onto Baghdad, we've got very little experience with. Fortunately, there are tools. And this is really more of a nod from the free Creekspiel to the strict Creekspiel techniques. You see the Army Technique publication 5-0.2. This is the book I would have killed to have when I was a young staff officer. It's got amazing staff planning tools, the planning factors that you'll need. Things such as your ratio of forces that you should have. Things like the rate of march in restricted, unrestricted, and severely restricted terrain. And the other tool that's useful is the correlation of forces and means calculator, which will give you an idea of what you should plan on in terms of losses depending on the type of operation. This is something that our staff officers need to have at their fingertips in order to do competent course of action analysis wargaming. However, it still does require some experience and some competence in the science of warfare, and it will take some time to apply it. Wargaming is a fairly timely process. So we're getting back to the action, reaction, counteraction. So what we're really saying here is that we're going to start off with, hey, what are we doing? What's our critical event or our decision point that we need to do at this stage of the battle? And then you'll have the folks conducting the war game adjudicate the actions that are being done, talking about movement rates, talking about expected losses as they get into combat. Then we are going to compare that to what is the enemy doing during all this? And then you'll adjudicate their actions that they're taking during all this. This doesn't mean it's the blue force always goes first and the red force goes second. The assumption is that this is stuff that's happening simultaneously, just that you're kind of splitting them apart so for analysis purposes, which gets us to the counteraction. It's not like a third turn. The counteraction here is what are those things that we as the friendly forces need to adjust in order to diminish what the enemy reaction is doing? What do we need to do to mitigate, nullify, or defeat what the enemy is trying to do? The old adage is if you find yourself in a fair fight, you didn't plan it properly. And this is where you're looking at that is how do we make this an unfair fight, lopsided for us? All right, so you're doing this at a minimum for every critical event and decision point. And you're also doing this against each plausible enemy course of action, at a minimum 2. You're doing your gaming against the enemy most likely course of action, and you're doing it against the enemy's most dangerous course of action. What's the one thing that the enemy could do that would seriously and totally be counter to what we're trying to achieve? All right, so we got 2 courses of action that we're trying to war game. Now, you remember that we said that we have to develop 3 courses of action. So really what we are expecting the staff to do is conduct 6 different war games. Remember that timeline, 1/3, 2/3 rule? Yeah, you're really going to be huffing and puffing to keep up with that timeline if you're trying to keep your war game down to about maybe 30% of the total time available to plan. Which is why when you say the term wargaming to a military officer, Army or Marine Corps officer, this is pretty much going to be their reaction. You'll get the 1,000-yard stare of what is going on. What do we have to do? It's not the fun activity that those of us that do this as a hobby are used to. It is a very drawn-out, intensive process that needs to be done under a very tight timeline. Okay, so that was a quick overview of how Army officers and Marine officers understand the term wargaming and why, when you mention it to them, why you might get a kind of a weird look from them. kind of the 1,000-yard stare like you see from the soldier in the middle. So at this point, let me go ahead and take your questions.
All right, thank you, Michael. Excellent presentation. Thank you. It was very informative. So I'm going to actually hand it off to Ed, who's been collecting the questions from the chat function, and he'll be presenting them for the sake of the YouTube channel. But so if you haven't already put it in the chat, please do so. And Ed, you can take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Ed Campbell. I'm also a Georgetown student. I'm in the Wargaming Society. And so the first question, there seems to be some significant interest in, so I'm kind of combining a couple questions that came in for this, Mr. Dunn.
Sure.
But it's in the creation of those probability chance. So when you're utilizing those staff tools in order to facilitate the wargaming actions, like how does probability and chance factor in? Is it deterministic? And like, what is the foundation for those staff tools that you had? Was that like, how were those developed and those calculations like generated?
They come from the operations research and system analysis community. The military has really gone into ORSA in a very big way, which stems back from World War II. So this is really based upon analysis of historical engagements, as well as comparing them and updating them to current capabilities. Keep in mind that everything that I mentioned is all unclassified, so you might not get the real world, here's what we really think might happen stuff in a unclassified environment. But it is the best stab of what we think could happen. As far as the tools themselves, as if they're deterministic or stochastic, it depends on what you're trying to get at. If you want to do it really quick and dirty, you can use the deterministic model that, hey, we put in input A and we'll always get output X based upon the process. I actually prefer to do the random event part, where you actually have to determine the probability of an outcome and essentially come up with a random method to determine so. Keep in mind, every time you roll the dice or do a chip pull to determine that outcome, you've created another wargaming point that you need to consider what would happen if the die roll went in the other direction.
Thank you. Another question was, or this part comment, part question. So from someone's personal experience, staffs are incredibly pressed for time. The 1/3, 2/3 rarely occurs, and often wargaming is one of the first steps that gets cut out in the attempt to try to get the order produced. And so what, do you have any TTPs that you've seen or recommendations for how they could make the process more efficient and more effective?
The heart of the problem is not so much the time available as it is the proficiency of the staff that's conducting the war game. As I mentioned, the free Creekspiel technique really relies upon the experience and expertise of the practitioners, the folks who are conducting it. If you are trying to do something that you've never done before or only done a handful of times, yes, it is going to be a lot slower. So my advice to all the staff officers out there, hit the books, learn the business, become an expert in your trade craft. Another technique in order to gain you some time is that parallel planning process, where you're issuing the warning orders, which will allow your lower echelon staff to get a jump start on their mission analysis of their KOA development. Another technique that's used, and oftentimes used at the lower tactical level, is the directed course of action, where the commander won't ask the staff to develop 3 courses of action in comparison, but the commander will have an idea of the course of action that she would like to execute and wants the staff just to examine it to see if it passes the FAST CD test. That really relies upon the judgment and experience of the commander, who generally should be the most proficient, experienced person in that echelon.
Thank you. Another question that just came in was, can you expand on some of the iterative natures of this process, such as branches and sequels, as those KOAs are developed?
Sure. You remember that I mentioned that you have a G5 or an S5 shop that is out there. And those are the ones that are responsible for future planning. Typically what will happen is, as an operations unfolding, the 5 shop and what's called the G35 shop is the future operations, is they'll be looking at the battlefield and they'll be looking at information coming in and they'll be doing the what if analysis. Well, they'll use that wargaming technique to look at different critical events and different decision points that might occur. A decision point, well, you could have multiple branches of that. And each of those possibilities, depending on the criticality of the decision point, really needs to be examined. So it's not uncommon that as the current operation is unfolding and you got the current operation cell that is guiding that and directing that operation, you'll have the future operations and for longer range plans, the planning shop doing those development of branches and sequels using wargaming techniques.
Thank you. And another question was that you kind of hit on as well a little bit, but can you really describe what the process and handover looks like as those plans move from G5 through the 3.5 into the G3?
Okay. Typically, there is a planning horizon that is set to each of the 3 different cells that are involved in planning, that actually have the responsibility for planning. Now, there is a time component, which basically says that current operations is during the 24 to 48 hours out. Future operations is doing 48 to maybe 96 hours out, and plans is doing anything that's a week or further out. That's one way of dividing it. I don't like that way of dividing it. In my mind, the way you should distinguish it is current operations should be just that. What is the current mission that we're executing? Future operations should be those decisions that the commander gets to make. How do I array my forces, which is pretty much already a done deal, and when do I commit my reserve, and when do I give a change of mission? Committing the reserve and giving a change of mission should be in the realm of the future operations shop. They should be doing the what if analysis that, hey, what do we, at what point does the commander need to make this decision? The plans shop should really be concerned with the change of mission component of it. We've finished our current mission. We've already planned the subsequent mission. What's next? What do we need to prepare for? To me, I'd rather have it be event-driven than a hard and fast time-driven. Not really a good way of doing business, in my view.
All right, the next question was, down to which echelon have you experienced or observed KOA wargaming?
I've seen it at division, I've seen it at brigade, and I've seen it at battalion. I've rarely ever seen it done well. It is generally a very painful process where the participants would rather stick sharp objects into their eyes to make the pain go away. And again, that's because of not really something that we're very proficient at. It's something that we need to practice more. You'll see this in the observations from the combat training centers, is that one of the first things that gets tossed overboard to save time is the war game. Well, when you do that, you're not really uncovering the things that can go wrong or the things that you need to mitigate for. And that is a time and again an observation that units, the mistake that units make.
If possible, can you just kind of describe, because we have a wide audience that arrives in these events, the difference between what a division, brigade, and then a battalion is, just like a quick
sure, absolutely. Okay, the lowest level that will do DMP is the battalion, and that is commanded by a lieutenant colonel, and it's typically anywhere from 400 to 1,200 personnel, depending on the type of unit that it is. The echelon above that is the brigade, commanded by a full colonel, and that's typically about 1,200 to 4,000 or 5,000 people. And that's where you really have a more robust plan shop. The echelon above that is division. And this is the first echelon commanded by a general officer, generally a 2-star officer. And they have a very robust staff. And this is where they are really looking at the future operations and plans that are further out in time. What is the so what of all this is that battalions, they're thinking in terms of hours. Brigades are thinking in terms of the next couple of days. It's divisions where you start really getting a longer planning horizon, where you're talking days that fade into weeks.
Thank you. And then another question was, to what degree is a hobbyist type wargaming included in the Army wargaming? Like, so as part of this, we've covered the process and understanding the Army's perspective of it. Earlier, you presented a slide where there'd be a different from expectation from those of us who are in the hobbyist. And so kind of to what does that kind of start playing into the wargaming process?
Okay, I'm glad that question came up. Unfortunately, it doesn't come into being as an effect very much. And that's because a shockingly few number of military professionals actually play war games. And that is something that a bunch of us that do play hobby war games are on a crusade and an insurgency to bring into the active force. What I found over the years, and one of our former students had actually did a study on this for his School of Advanced Military Studies monograph, is that when it comes to coming up with a course of action, we find that hobby war gamers are a lot better and more proficient at how to do it. That gets into the key components of what a commander does. That operations process, if you think back to it, it is very much a commander-driven process. And the commander needs to have an understanding of how the science of warfare unfolds. They need to be able to take that understanding and visualize how they want to conduct an operation to get to their end state. They need to describe that plan for somebody else to execute, and then they need to direct it. Give those orders and keep track of what's happening. What we have found is that hobby gamers are very, very adept at understanding and visualization. I can see hobby gamers that take a look at a set of rules and look at what they need to do to win, and they pretty much will be able to come up with a course of action inside of 5 minutes. They'll be able to come up with several courses of action inside of 15 minutes. Professional staffs that don't do this very often, unfortunately, will take significantly longer to be able to put together a course of action, and that's due to experience. Hobby gamers, on the other hand, do not do the describe and direct part of mission command very well. Something they just don't do. Whereas military professionals are very good at it. We're very good at producing orders, and we're very good at overseeing those orders being executed.
Thank you. And a somewhat related question that came in was, I think you kind of addressed on it, but I'd just be a little bit, if you could expand on it, which is how could an officer then get better at KOA wargaming in terms of like practical life? So what could they take? I know you kind of addressed some components of like wargaming, but what are other ways that an officer could try to practice and get better at this particular form of wargaming?
Okay, 2 things. Thing 1, master your warfighting function. When you're on a staff, you are the subject matter expert that everybody's going to be turning to for what you do, be it command and control, be it maneuver, be it fires, be it sustainment, be it protection, or be it intelligence. You need to be the person that understands thoroughly the capabilities of what your unit has in that warfighting function. The second thing that you can do is play games. You will find that the more war games you play and the more different type of war games that you play in the hobby that are available in the hobby market, you're going to find that your understanding the capabilities of your systems and your units will expand. You're going to find that you're going to take that knowledge and be able to visualize any particular problem that's given to you as a tactical problem. It's really, if you get good at those 2 things, you will be an absolute invaluable asset for a staff that you're on.
Thank you. Another question came in was, are there a difference between co-analysis for modeling against, state near-peer environments as opposed to some of the more hybrid warfare or even entirely non-state actors? An example would be like the difference between like the invasion in 2003 as well as the troop surge in 2006.
You're really getting into the strategic realm there, and you're not going to really be using MDMP so much as you are going to be using the Army design methodology, where you're framing the problem, you're framing what your desired end state is, and then you're framing how you're going to get from the current problem set to solve for the end state that you desire. So MDMP really is best used for conventional warfare. You can use it at the tactical level. But it really, really requires a really good understanding of enemy capabilities, and also really requires a thorough understanding of how civilians affect that type of environment. The variables that we're looking at in MDMP are the mission variables. You're looking at your mission, you're looking at the enemy, you're looking at your own troops, you're looking at the terrain and weather that you're operating in, you're looking at the time available to you, and you're also looking at the civilian component of the battlefield.
Thank you. Another question came in. I know your presentation focuses on the MDMP, but has there been any discussion or thoughts about including some sort of wargame component, like potentially being added to the troop leading procedures for organizations that are company and below? And then what would you think that could look like?
It's pretty much going to look like a tactical decision game, which is essentially a what now, Lieutenant type scenario. And it's one of those things that we want our tactical small unit decision makers to really consider. Here's my problem set, my mission I'm trying to achieve. Now let's consider that in terms of the mission variables of MET-TC. All right, here's my KOA. What could go wrong? It's not going to be as formalized as the KOA development, KOA analysis. It's really more of a back of the MRE box of what happens, what if type of exercise.
Thank you. Outside of the battlefield, how much does the KOA development is done by green suiters versus civilians? And then presumably the civilians, as you look at some of these like higher echelon staffs where you have much more civilian presence as they're the continuity, how much of that is really in their hands as opposed to the uniformed service members?
At the lower tactical levels, at the battalion, brigade, and division, not really at all. You really don't start getting civilian input in the operations realm until the corps or above. And the civilian component of that is really more concerned with the more of the operational and strategic realm.
Thank you. Wargaming against a mediocre enemy course of action is pointless. Where in the process does improving the, I apologize, I read that one direct, shouldn't I? Where in the process does improving the enemy course of action come in order to improve your own KOA development?
Well, and this is where you always wanted to wargame not just against the expected or the most likely course of action, but against the most dangerous course of action. And this requires some adeptness on the part of the intelligence folks to really come up with an enemy course of action that would just be a horrible thing for us to wargame against. So I really advocate very strongly that intelligence professionals really get good at wargaming so they have a rather extensive understanding and visualization of what the enemy could possibly do to us. Mediocre wargaming of enemy courses of action is a result of not really understanding the intelligence warfighting function and the capabilities of our adversaries. Hit the books, get smart on it.
One more question came in. So again, we're kind of reaching the trailer end of the tail end of the questions we have written down. So if anyone has them, please post them in chat. One just came in right now. Do you ever use wargaming as part of the order dissemination process to make sure subordinate commands understand the chosen KOA? So basically, do you use wargaming as a component of either the confirmation briefs or confirmation?
You can do it. A technique I've seen some headquarters do is that as you're doing parallel planning, you can actually bring in the subordinate units to take part in the war game with those critical events and the decision points. Not done very often. Typically what will happen is as you are moving out of planning and into the preparation activities, you will do a rehearsal of concept where you will actually have your subordinates walk through the plan. And that's where you get that understanding is, do the subordinate elements understand what we're trying to achieve, and do they understand the role in it? One of the things that comes out of the CTC experiences is that those units that don't do a war game at the staff level will find that rehearsal of concept with the subordinate units becomes a de facto war game, where you're going to have all the different commanders start thinking through, hey, what if? And by that point, it's probably a little bit too late. You wasted a lot of time.
This one coming in. What is your perspective on whether or not wargaming and KOA wargaming is taught systematically in the Army? What is your thoughts on that? Is it or is it not? And then how can we improve the systematic approach to teaching it?
The real problem that we're having is that we've not fought a large-scale combat operation in a long time. Not that that's a real problem realistically. I mean, God forbid that we ever have to fight another one. But the result is that we don't have that experience and that knowledge in our officer corps to draw upon. So the way to get around that is less free Creekspiel and more strict Creekspiel techniques, where you are going to look at those models that are being developed and you're going to apply those models over time, which is the de facto definition of a simulation, with decisions being made, which is the de facto definition of a war game.
Okay, and then one last question, trying to clarify, but please let me know if this makes sense from your experience level. So during wargaming, how do they manage the red, blue, and white cell functions, which constitute the blue force or friendly forces, the enemy forces, and then who is going to act as kind of like the adjudicator, or in the Creekspiel sense, like that game master who is running it?
Yeah, and you've hit on a real good point there. Because our professionals really don't have that experience with wargaming, typically what will happen is you'll have the blue cell represented by the 3 and the red cell represented by the 2. Now, if you remember, the 3 is typically the same rank as the chief of staff, which means the 3 outranks everybody else on the staff. So you will sometimes see the 3 pull rank on the 2. And I saw a comment there, are we assuming that we will win? And unfortunately, that may end up happening, where the 3, by virtue of rank or personality, will just run roughshod over everybody else. One of the things that we're trying to do is develop that competency at the divisions and higher, that you will have a white cell that does the adjudication, that will actually act as the facilitator, that will do the adjudication as the neutral party. The reason why I say division is that's the first echelon that you have dedicated officers that are adept at simulations. And it's also where the first echelon where you have ORSAs, folks that are able to do the operational research system analysis function, develop those models. And it's also the first echelon where we have what's called a red team. Despite its name, the red team is not a opposing forces function. The red team there is to make sure that we are not falling into groupthink. They're there to basically check our assumptions and make sure that we really are being exercising critical thought into what we're doing. At the brigade and battalion level, it's really more of an education of those field grade officers, the majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, that, hey, you need to put a check on yourself as you're doing KOA analysis at battalion and brigade, and that you need to be open-minded and listen to everybody on your staff.
Could modeling and simulation support strict KOA wargaming?
Oh, absolutely. As we turn to strict Creekspiel techniques, it's those models and simulations that will actually help our staff and our commanders as decision makers do those analysis. That said, one of the dangers that's out there is that we will develop a artificial intelligence machine learning tool that, if we just put in our mission analysis and we just put in what we're trying to do, that you press a button and that will come the right course of action to take. All right. The danger there is we don't war game in order to come up with the right answer. We do wargaming in order to uncover those things that we need to put more thought into. I always say that wargaming is not a predictive event, but it is a descriptive event, where you're looking at the what ifs, but you need to understand the outputs of the war game. You need to understand how you got to those results. It's not so much what happened, it's how did it happen and why did it happen.
And so another question, so as the red team, how do they go about ensuring that they're not mirror imaging or often too much thinking it through the lens of their training and upbringing, like let's say for US soldiers. So in your point, the G2, how is the G2 ensuring that they're analyzing the problem from an enemy perspective and could better guess what the enemy actions would take then?
Well, this is where you really need that subject matter expertise on the part of the two. The two has to be able to look at the enemy formations, understand their doctrine, understand their equipment, understand why they fight the way they fight. They kind of need to step out of the role of a blue side, and they need to really be able to put themselves in the mindset of what the red will do. This is why I really advocate, especially for the intelligence professionals, to do lots of hobby gaming so you can see how other forces think and how other forces do business. Let me give you an example on that, is that most games that you saw out there have play stupid rules for the Russians during World War II. And the concept behind that was, well, you know, the Russians didn't have much of a staff, and they weren't very imaginative, and they're very, very directive. Well, you peel that back and you find that the reason why at the tactical level they're very directive is that it gives them operational flexibility that the Germans and the West didn't have. Also gave them an advantage in execution. If you're doing battle by battle drill, you don't have to do a deep dive into mission analysis and orders production. You just tell your subordinate tactical elements, execute this battle drill. And if this is a handful of things that you're proficient and drilled at, well, you're able to do things a lot quicker. I love war games that take that into account. So if you're actually playing a World War II game where you actually get to apply Russian doctrine the way it's supposed to be, it is a very fearsome thing to go up against.
That's kind of the end of the question, unless anyone has any last minute questions. Otherwise, that's what we have so far.
And with that, should we all join me in thanking Mike for taking time to come and speak to us? Thank you very much.
As a final note, there was actually an excellent presentation that was given at the Connections US conference a week or so back by a professor at the Naval War College who goes by the name KJack. Has done a wonderful job presenting not just MDMP wargaming, but how all the other services look at it too. So I highly encourage you to go to the Connections USA 21 YouTube site and take a look at that video.
And speaking of videos, the recording of this event will be available on the Georgetown Wargaming Society's YouTube page, hopefully sometime later today or tomorrow. But once again, thank you, Michael. And I think with that, we'll end. All right.